I'll place my knapsack on my back, my rifle on my shoulder. I'll march away to the firing line, kill that Yankee soldier. I'll kill that Yankee soldier. I'll march away to the firing line and kill that Yankee soldier. I'll bid farewell to my wife and child, farewell to my aged mother. I'll go and join in the bloody strife till this cruel war is over, till this cruel war is over. I'll go and join in the bloody strife till this cruel war is over. If I am shot on the battlefield, then I should not recover. Oh, who will protect my wife and child? Who care for my aged mother? Who'll care for my aged mother? Oh, who will protect my wife and child and care for my aged mother? And if our southern cause is lost and southern rights denied us, we'll be ground beneath the tyrant's heels for our demands of justice, for our demands of justice. We'll be ground beneath the tyrant's heels for our demands of justice. Before the South shall bow her head, before the tyrants harm us, I'll give my all to the Southern cause and die in the Southern Army. I'll die in the Southern Army. I'll give my all to the Southern cause and I'll die in the Southern Army. If I must die from a home and land, my spirit
And we are live. Alhamdulillah. Wassalat wassalam. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. This broadcast, thanks to your generosity and live recording, is day 290 of the project, Driving Dixie Down. We're continuing our discussion of the American Civil War, today placing it more firmly, as we have all week really, within the larger story of Mexico, of England, of France, and indeed of liberalism in the 19th century. Before we get too long in the tooth, one announcement concerning Apocatastasis, and I'll bring our screen share to bear, and that is about our coming plans for the college. And I did a whole recording lately on this, as well as a newsletter write-up. I hope you're on our newsletter. More or less gets out once a week. It's almost like the Arab calendar. You want it to be out on Friday, and like every day it slips back a day earlier so that you end up cycling through the whole week over 7 letters. Eventually you get back to Friday. But this is the writing, or rather the recording. We're going to need a bigger ship. We need a location here at Apocatastasis. As we move from strength to strength, we need a location to teach and for various of our other public outreaches and for our other scholars as we grow this vision into a more perfect union, into a more perfect reality. How do you like that for reference there? So you can check that out. And I also have the pertinent newsletter with Roy Schneider's character. There's your Jaws. We're going to need a bigger boat. It actually was Roy Schneider's character in Jaws, not the grizzled Quint that said the lines, "We're going to need a bigger boat." But who could pass up this thumbnail? Okay, so there's that. And okay, so next thing we're going to do is adjust our background music sufficiently Southern, I trust. Get some fiddle music here. It's almost like, for very good reason, the Celtic music I sometimes occasionally play, that's the word. Insofar as you have to be very careful with the volume, otherwise it would become very obnoxious to hear me talking at the same time as the music. And I make the reference to the Celtic stuff. This is obviously Southern bluegrass. But there are obvious roots between the American fiddle and folk tradition and the British one, the Irish one. So, all right. I think we go a little bit louder and still be safe. Okay. So I will, in the next few minutes, I will double and triple check that before really committing to that volume. It should be okay, though. All right, so here we are. We're looking at the American Civil War. Our poem for today will not be a proper poem, but will be the Gettysburg Address, which is a very poetical piece of prose. And we will slot that in appropriate. And in fact, we might want to slot it in earlier than later. But yeah, we're going to look at the second half of this section on the American Civil War, what is still legally called the War of the Rebellion by the United States government, something which would have been seen by the Southerners perhaps as the Second American Revolution, and it has other more spicy terms as well, like the War of Northern Aggression. Okay. And we looked at H.G. Wells yesterday. We got into the concept of secession. Again, this is all very superficial in this text. With the development of the project in coming years, we will have different tiers and so forth. I'm looking right now, actually, at platforms like Locals and things for more serious students. You don't have enough time to enroll full time, whatever the case may be, but you want to check in more than our monthly students. Looking at Locals, maybe we meet 2 or 3 times a week privately, of course hanging everything off of this world history, not just the outline of history, but the poetry and eventually a great synchronization of additional appropriate reading. So that's my big project this summer, is to get all that coordinated, but it's coming together very nicely. This series, which is dealing just with one part of our unified curricula, this is coming out quite nicely and quite regularly. I'm certainly enjoying it. I trust you are as well. So without further ado, I'm going to change the camera and we're going to get into H.G. Wells's meditation on the U.S. Civil War in the context of geopolitics. As I said, I've always been a Civil War buff, going back to my earliest years, so I have much to say. I'm an official reenactor as well, for what that's worth. And certainly, this is the definitive event in American history. the War of the Rebellion, so-called. It's not actually the revolution. Although it's worth remembering that many men were still around who very likely had not themselves fought in the revolution, but had been children at that time, or would have had plenty of fathers and grandfathers who had fought in the revolution. And so you can bet your bippy, as the British say, and we're going to be looking at the British as regards the U.S. Civil War momentarily, you can bet your bippy that the proximity to the American Revolution definitely plays a role here. To an extent, and I don't think I'm being polemical or partial when I say this, but to an extent, what you see in the U.S. Civil War really is the death of one type of America, and frankly, the original version of America. That kind of Jeffersonian agricultural type that is shoved off by bayonet and by cannon, shoved off of American history in favor of the banker and the industrialist. More of that Hamiltonian strain of America. Dare I say Washingtonian, Federalist. Anyhow, we did a quick, super quick nutshell. I basically jumped from the secession crises to the collapse of the Confederate Army, which is appropriate here. Actually, I'm giving more attention to this event than we have with other wars. Tomorrow, Friday, we're going to get into the Boer War, by the way. So just war. We have the Wars of German Unification on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, U.S. Civil War, and Boer War. We also had the World's Fair this week. Next week, we're actually going to continue our violent streak and talk about the Boxer Rebellion and colonialism in the East. But for now, we're on the war cycle. Okay, as the Civil War dragged on through 1862 and 3, the first passions of enthusiasm waned, and America learned all the phases of war weariness and war disgust. I remember reading a woman at the start of the Civil War in the West, and that's a whole can of worms, the Western theater. Very much a fire-breathing secessionist at the start of the war, who herself wrote that by the end of the war, with all of the raiding and mischief and murder and vendettas that were prominent in places like Kansas, by the end of the war, she said that there was nothing that she wouldn't give in this world to see a Yankee soldier. So that's what war can do. The Arabs say that war is a beautiful, bouncing, perky young woman when she walks into the room, and all the men go to embrace perky, bouncing, young, warm war. And when they do, she turns into a stinking old woman, a stinking old hag, like on that scene in The Shining. That's war. War weariness and war disgust. Conscription replaced volunteering by mid-war and changed the spirit of fighting both in the South and in the North. The war became a prolonged, dismal, fratricidal struggle. July 1863, right after Gettysburg, saw the New York rioting against the drafts, and the Democratic Party in the North sought to win the presidential election on the plea that the war was a failure and should be discontinued. This would, of course, have meant a practical victory for the South. They actually ran McClellan, the Democratic Party ran McClellan in 1864, obviously one of Lincoln's former generals, and one who was very popular amongst the rank-and-file soldiers. But there was no serious threat to Lincoln's presidency. There were organized conspiracies to defeat the draft. The gaunt, tall man at the White House found himself with defeatist traitors, dismissive generals, torturous party politicians, and a doubting and fatigued people behind him. And uninspired, there's that word again, uninspired generals and depressed troops before him. And his chief consolation must have been that Jefferson Davis at Richmond could be in little better case. Actually, I would say that Davis was, in terms of his administration, in a much more chaotic situation. Davis did not have the politic touch that Lincoln had. And Davis's cabinet was constantly at war, if you forgive the pun there, constantly at war with itself. It would have done some good to the Confederacy if the Parliament had been, or if the cabinet had been at war with the Union. But it was constantly ripping its guts out, constantly having dramatics. And as I close the window here, constantly full of petty people. In addition, Davis had generals, and his chief generals were scarcely any better in terms of their own pettiness and perhaps insanity. I'm thinking of Braxton Bragg in particular, and how that man possibly could have been in the leadership positions he was given. That man was so incompetent, it almost lends credence to the idea of the entire Confederacy being a setup. And that's a whole other line of talk. Perhaps if you enroll in our Civil War class, I will get into it some fine day. But part of that idea also comes with the behavior of people after the war. Sometimes called the Great Nevermind, where you have all these Confederate generals, including Lee, with these very conciliatory statements, which, you can understand it, but, they're basically saying, oh, we're all just brothers all along, and this is a big misunderstanding. Well, why did you fight a war for 4 years and kill millions of people? That number, the U.S. American casualties and Confederate casualties, constantly are being revised upward. Not only was Davis's cabinet very chaotic, but also his general staff, let's say. And besides Lee was very politic. Lee knew how to manage the generals and their tantrums and his subordinate generals. But the other major generals, simply were drama queens, let's say. Joe Johnson and Davis never got along, and Hood and Joe Johnson, and so forth. Anyhow, the English government had misbehaved. Now we're getting to the international scene here, and permitted the Confederate agents in England to launch and man 3 swift privateer ships. The Alabama is best remembered in song and in story, and these ships were chasing United States shipping from the seas. The French army, let's not forget, we had this whole section earlier this week on Napoleon III in Mexico, and why? Why didn't Napoleon III in France squish the rising German unification? Well, because they were absorbed in Mexico and their own foreign adventures. The French army, yes, in Mexico, is trampling the Monroe Doctrine in the dirt. You'll recall the Monroe Doctrine, going back to the early republic, is this statement that European powers will not be tolerated for European powers to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. I always mix it up. Northern, well, I can get northern and southern, but yeah, I guess Western Hemisphere. The Americas, basically. Came subtle proposals from Richmond to drop the war and leave the issues of war for subsequent discussion and turn federal and Confederate alliance upon the French in Mexico. Now, Richmond, even besides the international stuff, Richmond was constantly trying to come to an agreement with Lincoln. Lincoln would not do so because, as I mentioned, Lincoln, he was such a debater that he would often, as a policy, allow for his opponent's arguments, almost all of them, to triumph. This was a deliberate policy to retreat and retreat and retreat in a debate. However, what Lincoln would not do is budge on 1 or 2 points. And that's what he did when it came to the debate, we'll say, with the Confederacy, where Lincoln allowed that, they ought to be allowed to keep their slaves, at least up until mid-war. He allowed that the Confederacy had been wronged in certain aspects, that the northern states had acted out of turn here or there, and various other points about the Southern experiment in secession. However, Lincoln never admitted that the Confederacy was a state. And that was largely on the grounds that, as far as he was concerned, and the federal policy, that the Confederacy had stolen federal property and had overturned elections as well. Had overturned and ignored the duly appointed elections. So the Confederacy was not, as far as Lincoln was concerned, an actual government. This is absolutely needs to be understood. Lincoln never considered the Confederacy a legal government. They were simply de facto. And so the reason he never, and his administration never treated with peace treaties from the South is he did not believe the South literally could conduct peace treaties. In fact, getting to something I alluded to, that is one aspect of the legal mess which has never been resolved from the U.S. Civil War, which is the fact that there was a cessation of hostilities, but there was no actual peace treaty with the Confederacy. And then that raises the question, well, these things called, the reconstructed states, well, what the hell are they? And that was a huge controversy. I got into the Alan Nevins series, and that really comes up again and again. What do we do with these states when they come back into the Union? Do they go through the whole process again of, like a terror? This with the Constitution, you have a whole series of steps that a territory has before it becomes a state. Does that have to go into effect? Can you just rehabilitate the former Confederate states? What do you do about the office holders? And Lincoln took a very mild position when it came to that, compared to others in the Republican Party. But Lincoln would not listen to such proposals unless the supremacy of the Union was maintained. Americans might do such things as one people, but not as two, regarding, burying the hatchet and driving the French out of Mexico, circling the wagons. Lincoln was not going to do that. We need to do one thing at a time, is his mind. We need to have one nation, not two, and then we can deal with the French in Mexico. He held the United States. So you notice, by the way, that there's a very heavy focus in this section on Lincoln. Anyhow, he held the U.S. together through long, weary months of reverses and ineffective effort, through blank phases of division and failing courage. And there is no record of him ever faltering on his purpose. There were times when there was nothing to be done, when he sat in the White House silent and motionless, a grim monument of resolve. They said Lincoln would almost be in trance states. Just something to think about. It's a man of such energy and yes, dynamism, and yet to be in such a state, occasionally be found to be in such a state. Times when he relaxed his mind by jesting and broad anecdotes. Could never get enough of the anecdotes. By the way, on this topic of Confederate peace efforts, I would very much recommend the film, I don't recall the year, maybe 2011, called Lincoln by Steven Spielberg. And that gets into a somewhat, it's a fictionalized film. I mean, it's a drama, so there's a few historical points that aren't accurate, but it's eminently, for a piece of art, for a piece of mythology, which needn't be strictly historical, it is an eminently good piece, and it deals with a few plots. One of which is the primary one is the the 13th Amendment. Yeah, the 13th Amendment. The abolition of chattel slavery, the first of what we call the Reconstruction Amendments. And then the kind of a B plot there is the Confederate peace proposal in the winter of 1865. And one of the historical inaccuracies, for dramatic effect, is that these two events, which they took a while each of them to play out, but they're presented as having happened at the exact same time, where I believe the 13th Amendment had been passed by the time the Confederates had made their last formal gestures for peace before the collapse of Richmond. And I should say, let me just finish this section, then I'll make the point I want. Okay, Lincoln was full of sardonic humor and very tender with the pain of others. When some enemies of Grant come to tell him that the general drank, he asked for the brand of whiskey famously, for the others, he said. Lincoln was a man himself very abstemious. We don't see that word. It means you don't drink. Well, you're very Spartan in your diet altogether, and that would include alcohol. Capable of either immense industry or immense patience. And I think Daniel Day-Lewis's presentation of Lincoln, was very well done. And it does capture the spirit of the time if it does flub a few particulars. At last, in the early months of 1865, it was plain that victory was coming, and Lincoln set himself with all his force to make surrender easy and the treatment of the vanquished the beginning of a reconciliation. Just a few points here. So the Civil War is a perfect example of what we call a war of attrition. And by mid-war, it seems that both sides had settled in that this was going to be how the war would be resolved. And that is you stretch your opponent's resources and you slowly grind down his resolve. And some of the thing you will see with wars of attrition, I'm trying to think, I believe I brought this discussion up before in some other context. I think maybe, I don't recall actually, but anyhow, I do believe I did so. You can check the previous recordings. Wars of attrition tend to drag on and on and on. And then when that rubber band snaps, when the army snaps and the government snaps, it snaps like a rubber band very fast. So it's a slow, here's a rubber band, right? Here's a rubber band. This is a war of attrition. A war of attrition. Here's a rubber band with my hands. Let's pull this up. Okay, here's a rubber band. Okay, a war of attrition is pulling the band, pulling the band, pulling the band. I'm not gonna do it, but eventually that army and the population and the government snap. Somebody snaps. You cannot just keep pulling this forever. And often with wars of attrition, in retrospect, the people who appear to be winning are the ones that snap. The Confederacy obviously was in a position in 1865, as it had bogged down the U.S. Army around Petersburg in the north, and was having markedly less success in the South with Sherman's march to the sea. But it was inflicting such casualties that it was hoping to break the will of the North. And hence, amongst other reasons, these titanic battles such as the Wilderness and Cold Harbor, which get surprisingly less attention than Gettysburg. And I say that because the Wilderness and Cold Harbor, and certainly Petersburg, are way more indicative of future fighting, particularly the First World War, than Gettysburg was. In any case, so the Confederacy is strong enough in the winter of 1865 to make a peace effort, and they send ambassadors to what was it called? Something city. It was basically Grant's headquarters on the river. And at this point, Lincoln kind of gives tacit, it's the closest, and this is the drama, that Spielberg film, kind of gives tacit permission for one of the federal senators to go and parley for peace. And the drama of the film, and this is my last time referencing the film, the drama of the film is, Lincoln's wavering because of the humanitarian cost to the war. He's wavering on his position that the Confederacy is in a government, because if you're sending senators to tarry with the representatives of another government, what it believes is a government, the Confederacy, then you are de facto acknowledging them as a legitimate state. You would not be meeting their ambassadors if that was not the case. So there you go. What else was I going to say here? No, it'll come to me. Attrition, I think that was the main point. Just the wars of attrition tend to drag on, and then as we see, when the snap comes, it comes fast. And some other analogs would be the Germans in the First World War, 1918, and then much more recently, actually, the collapse of the liberal Afghan government in the face of the Taliban after a 20-year war of attrition. And you'll see eventually, you will see this is how the Ukraine conflict is resolved. It will snap very quickly. Anyhow, Lincoln saw the Union triumphant. He lived to see it. He entered Richmond the day after its surrender and heard of Lee's capitulation shortly thereafter. He returned to Washington. Literally, I mean, that's a perfect example, the rubber band of Lee's army around Petersburg. Grant was literally, with his resources, able to extend the trench lines. Grant could almost indefinitely extend the trench lines. What Lee would have to do then is, peel off more people to match those trench lines around Petersburg, which was a big railroad junction and supply depot. And then Grant would just keep doing this. And the more Lee did that, the thinner and thinner the manning of the trenches around Petersburg got, because Lee had to keep stripping off soldiers to go and make these new trenches and to go man these new trenches. So the entire defenses were overextended. They were a mile wide and an inch deep, which put Petersburg's defense in great jeopardy, and that therefore put Richmond in great jeopardy because it's just up the road. And eventually Lee has to just abandon that, right? I mean, in order to preserve the army, he has to abandon that, and then that begins these series of almost boxing match encounters over the next week, which lead to Appomattox Courthouse. Anyhow, after visiting Richmond, Lincoln returned to Washington on April 11th and made his last public address. His theme was reconciliation and the reconstruction of loyal government in the defeated states. And then on the evening of the 14th, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater, famously, and as he sat looking at the stage, he was shot in the back of the head and cruelly murdered by an actor named Booth, who had some sort of grievance against him and who crept into the box unobserved. There's all sorts of counter narratives on that point. Was Seward behind it? Maybe. If the work of healing was impaired, and if these United States had more trouble and bitterness in the years following the war, then there was need for it. It was because Lincoln was dead, right? So Lincoln was a moderating force. And if he seemed like a hard ass with the Confederacy, he was just as much a hard ass with the Republican Party, of which he was a part. And I think that was the hangnail that eluded me just now. Yeah, Lincoln has some real radicals in the Republican Party, including communists as well. Famously, was it Fremont? Well, I think Fremont was a commie. If it wasn't him, it was Ben Butler. But yeah, there's a very infamous countermand Lincoln has to give to one of his more leftist commanders who just freed the slaves on his own initiative early in the war. I think it was Fremont. But anyway, where was I going? Yes, and Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania would be the great example of one of these radical Republicans, and a man representative of a certain attitude in the North. The North had suffered greatly by what it saw as a tantrum on the part of the South, a tantrum because the South didn't get a president they wanted, so they just decided to provoke this in a roundabout way, provoked this conflict. I'm just trying to encapsulate a certain sentiment in the North. And men like Stevens wanted to exile all Confederates, kick them out of the country, and turn their land over to freed slaves, which is exactly what the radical Southerners were saying before the 1860 election. It's almost like Hitler. Everything Hitler said would happen to Germany if the communists took over is exactly what happened when that came to pass. And the same with, at the time probably seemed like over-the-top exaggerations, but indeed, Stevens did want that. Okay, but Lincoln's work was done, and the Union was save it and save it for good. At the beginning of the war, there was no railway, now we get into logistics, to the Pacific coast. Now the railway spread like a swiftly growing plant until they had clutched and held and woven all the vast territory. So we began with this meditation during the look at the Missouri Compromise and so forth, the role of technology and communications weaving together this country, which had this happened 100 or 200 years before, America and the development of the American civilization may not have come to pass. The states would have been too far away to be governed by Washington, and then you might have seen had this sort of thing happened, and westward expansion and manifest destiny happened in a theoretical universe 200 or 300 years before. You might have seen America develop very likely like Western Europe or Africa, where it's just too far away to actually govern. So you have these independent statelets that develop their own cultures and eventually break off. Anyway, that's not what happened. And the vast territories of these United States were now one indivisible mental and material unity. And Nevins gets into that aspect as well. That change, the spiritual change in America, shall we say, the mental change after the war. From that time, the consolidation of these United States has gone on steadfastly. Within half a century, its population had passed the 100 million mark, and there is no sign that growth and development have yet reached by 1920, when this is first published, any limitations. The Titanic democracy, without king or elaborate foreign policy, as we repeat, oh God, if you can only live now, elaborate foreign policy, is, we repeat, a new thing in the world's experience. It is not a great power, in the sense, now this is where the outline of history is dated, right? This is a book that was originally published in 1920. It is not a great power in the sense in which the phrase was used in Europe. It is something more modern in its nature and greater, with a greater destiny. In the subsequent century, I'm afraid America has gone down the path of every other perceived power, and smarts for it, I should think. Anyway, that's our second look at the section in the outline from the U.S. Civil War. And now we're going to take a look at something I promised to do at the beginning of class, which is take a look at the Gettysburg Address. This is going to serve for our poetry for today. There's all sorts of poetry from the war, not to be too Confederate-minded, as we had the Southern Soldier opening song, The Conquered Banner by a Catholic priest, Father Abraham Ryan, is well worth looking into to get a snapshot of the Confederate position. There's also a British rejoinder to that poem called A Reply to the Conquered Banner by an attorney by the name of Henry Houghton. And they're worth looking into. And there's also, talking about race relations, there's another poem written by an Irish Union soldier called Sambo's Right to be Kilt. Which is a snapshot of the discussion of, do we arm the blackamoors to fight? And in the opinion of this poet, yes, because I'd sooner have a black man take a bayonet, or any man, than myself, or take a bullet. That's kind of the nutshell there. And in any case, a lot of prose in the 19th century. That's interesting. I said that to someone the other day, right? I mean, we have so much more knowledge at our fingertips. We probably could spend a year just reviewing the podcasts and the blogs that just were published today. We have so much more knowledge, and yet our writing is abysmal, absolutely abysmal. If you believe it, the story with this Gettysburg Address is that Lincoln wrote it on the train from Washington to Pennsylvania there. So, in any case, a very, very stirring piece of prose. By the way, if you go to this battlefields.org, you can see this augmented reality. I don't know what's going to happen there. I'll play around with it after, but you don't have Lincoln. You get stuck with me to read this. Here we go. And this is November, right? This is, if you're not familiar, this is at the commencement and the committal and the consecration of the Gettysburg battlefield. So it's some months after the battle. And it's interesting, if you look at historical places, how towns react to notable events. Some towns embrace it like there's no tomorrow. Gettysburg is one such example. Salem, Massachusetts is a strange example because the witch hunts didn't actually take place in that town. But by Jim, didn't that not stop the Chamber of Commerce? And then other towns, not that interested in spending the rest of history reliving a few days or a battle or whatever that happened there. I saw, something very innocuous yesterday in Danville. Speaking of the end of the Confederacy, Danville. I don't think, there's probably not one person in Gettysburg that doesn't know about the Battle of Gettysburg because of all the monuments and stores and tourists. I don't think there's one person in Danville who could tell you the significance of Danville in the Civil War. It's just interesting how different towns react differently. Anyhow, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Tu autem Domine miserere nobis. Thus is the Gettysburg Address, November 19th, 1863. Just look at the sentences here. They're so much longer. Our Twitter brains. Well, there we go. There's your Gettysburg Address, one of the finest pieces of American oratory, and frankly, one of the finest pieces of oratory in history. They say that the man before Lincoln, who was actually a notable figure, of course his name is escaping me, thus goes all fame. He spoke for an hour or two, and no one remembers what he said, but Lincoln spoke for a few minutes. So you can often say more with less, can't you? Oh, that fellow's name is right on the tip of my tongue. All right, but we'll bring the bird down here and trust the music's behaving itself. Yeah, there you go. You're having flashbacks to Johnny... Charlie Daniels. Lord rest him. Charlie Daniels. Charlie Daniels used to play somewhat regularly in Danbury on his tours. One of my regrets is not going and seeing him on one of the last swings through that he made here. But anyhow, you see after the Civil War, the rise indeed of an American consciousness. Something is set in motion that will certainly be completed by the Second World War. And that is the end of regionalism in America, not just politically in the North-South blocks, or the Western bloc, which is of course the rising culture, but because you have men from all over the South in the different Confederate forces mingling, and the same in the North, and indeed in various times men who would never, in North to South, South to North, never have met each other, never have interacted with such cultures. Because you have this rising American consciousness as opposed to the regional consciousness, and that will be very much more so the case in the Second World War, and we can have a whole discussion as to why that is in terms of how units were organized. And that's a whole topic. In fact, that's where Nevin's, this series, The Fight for the Union, really gets into that logistical aspect. So originally in the Civil War, a lot of the units were, actually, all of the units were like state units, and even federal units were raised by governors. And so it was this weird bleed over of federal authority and whatnot. But anyhow, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves for our survey course. So this is day 290 of the project here at ApocatastasInstitute as we make our way through Western civilization. Tomorrow we'll get into the Boer War, and that will bring our attention next week to Oriental colonization in the late 19th century, the Boxer Rebellion and things like that. Please check out the project here at ApocatastasInstitute. So you can download this text and follow along every day. I don't read everything here, so there's a lot more that Wells has up his sleeve. And then as the weeks roll along here, as we get to the restart of the project, please consider enrolling as a private student here at ApocatastasInstitute. So we're going to be looking into things like locals and whatnot to have intermediary students, so not just general public stuff. When I do these recordings every day, we got that's great, and then we have our full-time students and our monthly students, but something between the full-time and the monthly, maybe 3 or 4 sessions a week, a little bit more manageable for family men and so forth. So keep an eye on that. This is very much a work in progress, but it's coming together nicely, thank God, and it's been great to have you here today. Thanks so much, and have a grand day.